I'm Josh Mack. I'm the VP of Marketing at the museum, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to our fifth keynote event of today's inaugural New York Jewish Book Festival. This keynote is Our Country Friends with Gary Shteyngart and Alex Halberstadt. We hope that you will explore the text says 32 events, but frankly, a lot of them have already happened, but that you continue after this to stay here, see other events that are happening throughout the museum, meet some of the speakers, and get books signed at some of the signings we have in our main lobby and also in the events hall on the second floor. You can buy books downstairs and then bring them up to the events hall to get them signed. And for those of you joining us via live stream, there are 2 more keynote events today, and you can find the schedule at nyjewishbookfestival.org and purchase the books at mjhnyc.org/shop. While you're here, we also encourage you to take the time to visit our exhibitions, The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do on the main level, and Survivors, Faces of Life After the Holocaust, photographs by Martin Scholler, which is on the 3rd floor. Our cafe is open. I would also say that the Holocaust, What Hate Can Do, our new core exhibition, opened over the summer, and I can understand if you don't want to go and explore the entire thing. I hope you come back to. But the first 2 rooms, once you turn the corner into a hallway about April of 1943, the next room is about Judaism, who Jews are, all languages, and it's amazing artifacts that you'll see. And then the next room is about historic anti-Semitism. So those are in themselves really wonderful exhibits to see if you don't want to see the rest. Obviously, our shop is open for holiday gifts and books coming into Hanukkah. We are encouraging people to wear masks, but you're doing that. This program is made possible in part by support from Battery Park City Authority, and your donations also help us present these programs. I am really bereft, actually, to tell you that Alex's book is not, we had a mix-up with delivery, and Alex's book is not immediately available after this program. We will have it in our store probably early next week. So let me yes. Galleries in the exhibit will be open. We're open until around 8:30, 9 o'clock tonight. So after this, feel free to wander around. Our speakers. Gary Shteyngart is the New York Times best-selling author of the memoir Little Failure and the novel Super Sad True Love Story, Lake Success, Absurdistan, and the Russian Debutante's Handbook. His books regularly appear on bestseller lists, best of lists around the world, and have been published in 30 countries. Alex Halberstadt is the author of the family memoir Young Heroes of the Soviet Union, a New York Times critic's top book of 2020, as well as Lonely Avenue, The Unlikely Life and Times of Doc Pomus. He's a regular contributor to the New York Times Magazine, and his writing has appeared in The New Yorker, the New York Times Book Review, Saveur, Travel and Leisure, GQ, Food and Wine, MoMA Magazine, and the Paris Review. He's been nominated twice for the James Beard Award for Excellence in Journalism, and his essays have been anthologized in the Best Food Writing of 2014 and the Best American Food Writing of 2018. So again, Gary will be signing books outside after this, and please look for Alex's book next week on our site and in bookstores. It's a tremendous book. So thank you. Please welcome our panelists to the stage. Thanks.
This is a smart audience. Thank you. Wow, I've been sitting on my mic. Whew. Nice.
Hi, Gary.
Hey, Alex. Good
How's
to
it
see
going
you.
so far?
It's going great. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming. What should we talk about?
Well, to start with, Alex and I have pretty much the same background. We both went to Stuyvesant High School, yeah. I knew it. I knew there'd be a lot of clapping because it's right down the hall, down the street. Then we went to the Oberlin Institute for Lonely People. Yeah, one person. All right. One. We miss you. And then we both worked at the New York Association for New Americans, everybody's favorite resettlement agency, which was just down the street, too.
Yeah, it's about 100 yards here in Battery Place. And some of you here are, in fact, Soviet immigrants and probably are familiar with the New York Association for New Americans. But Gary, we had the same job. We were called staff writer. And it was your first job out of college, right?
It was my second job out of college. So the first job I had was as a paralegal. I don't know if I can't say that without laughing, for a civil rights law firm that was all Oberlin graduates as well. But I was such a terrible paralegal that I lasted about 9 months. And they were always saying, "Where's the work product?" And I'm like, "What?" Because at Oberlin I majored in, I don't know, Beetle studies or something. I was just not ready for the world of law.
I don't even remember.
Yeah, and so after I was fired there, my mom worked for HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and Mom said, "Oh yeah, I'll get you a job at Niana." And I remember it was $23,000 a year. Oh, and I lived in like a hut by the river. Yeah.
So in your first novel, and I'm going to just dispense with the fiction that your novels and your life are utterly unconnected, you called it the Emma Lazarus Immigrant Absorption Society. And I think the sentence in your book is, on the 10th floor, the Emma Lazarus Immigrant Absorption Society greeted its clients with the familiar yellow water-stained walls and dying hydrangeas of a sad third world government office. And I think for anybody who's been to Niana, that can testify that that's pretty accurate.
Yeah, no, and I wrote that book when I was still at Oberlin, a lot of it. And I had, interned at Niana for a couple of summers, and I just thought it was so incredible. I mean, it wasn't just resettling small, furry Soviet Jews like myself. There were people from all over the world were being resettled. The whole thing was just kind of, I don't know, it felt like a sitcom sometimes. But so I began to take notes while I was working there. And by the way, when I say working, I worked maybe a couple hours a day, and the rest of the time I worked on my fiction. So the real mitzvah of that workplace was allowing Russian Jews time to do their own creative work instead of helping other Soviet Jews. Yeah.
I remember a guy named Sasha who, like the protagonist of your novel, who used to walk around with a big mug of coffee that just reeked of whiskey. And it was a really great place to work.
Sashenko was incredible. We were in the same department, whatever the hell that was, and he did have the whiskey mug, and he was always like, "You got to try this whiskey," because he drank many kinds of really good whiskey. I hope Locke's has some good whiskey like that at the restaurant here.
And this was like at 11 a.m.
11 a.m., and then we would get really drunk after reading Akhmatova and other poems together, and he would say, "Gary, just lie down," and then he had this inflatable mattress. And he was always sprawling out, but sometimes when he wasn't using it, he allowed us to use it. This is like every Russian's dream, is to have a workplace like this,
You're probably expecting something a little more literary. So let me raise the level of our discourse a little bit. A lot of the characters in your book, our country friends, are, it's a book of middle age in some ways. They are, Uncle Vanya in the play is 47, and it's pretty close to the core group in your novel. And they do a lot of looking back, they do a lot of retrospection. And looking back this was now 25 years ago, Niana. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what you remember about yourself and how you experienced the world back then? Yeah,
sure. So when I first graduated from Oberlin, I was very scared because at the college they told me, "You were a good writer. They have an award that they always give an award at the end." And I thought, okay, I have a career now ahead of me. But then you show up in Manhattan, and that's always the scary part when you come back to New York and you realize everyone else has the same idea. Everyone else thinks they're an incredible writer. But I had a bunch of friends from Stuyvesant, and Stuyvesant was sort of the real crux of my life, I think, was not even just emigrating from the Soviet Union, it was also going to Stuyvesant because it allowed me to escape Eastern Queens and the Solomon Schechter School of Queens, where I was brought up. And it was such a parochial environment. I remember I spent the first 10 years of my life without even knowing where and what Manhattan was, because we thought that the 3 skyscrapers on Queens Boulevard at the time, that was Manhattan. So when I actually landed in Manhattan, I was like, holy cow, this place is enormous. But Stuyvesant really was very helpful in getting rid of a lot of those thinking, and especially this kind of blinkered Russian, let's be frank, very racist kind of way of looking at the world, and all of that began to dissipate very quickly in Stuyvesant because almost all the kids were from other parts of the world. In my year, it was about 50% were foreign born. Now I think it's something like 85%. So that was really helpful to expanding my view of the world. And of course, Manhattan, nothing against Queens. Queens is one of my top 3 boroughs, but and the Bronx, yeah. But it was, there was definitely a feeling of having my mind blown and expanded, etc. So, but coming back after Oberlin, you realize that every other person, I remember meeting you and they were like, Alex is a poet. And I was like, God damn it, another one? Like, what? Yeah, did anyone not have the same dreams as we did? But apparently everyone did. So I was very scared. But in terms of writing about elderly people, by which I mean people like myself at this point, I think it was reading Chekhov and rereading Chekhov during the beginning of the pandemic that did it for me. Because if you look at Chekhov's best work, whether in stories or the plays, it's all the same thing. People in the countryside are in their late 40s, early 50s, which in Russian terms is like 100 and 120, and they're looking back at their lives, and all they have is regrets. Nothing good happened. Everything was terrible. And I felt that kind of, I mean, Chekhov wasn't Jewish, but he understood the power of the kvetch. He was a master kvetcher. And he, I think, really captured in this kind of both humorous, generous, warm prose, all the things that we like to think are also inherent in Jewish literature. He used all of those things to talk about the regrets of middle to late midlife. And being in the country, so I split half my time in the city and half in the greater Rhinebeck area, if you will. But being up there for the pandemic, and at this point I was also writing a really failing novel that was set in the future, and the future imagined that NYU, New York University, had taken over all of Manhattan and had built a wall around it, a violet-colored wall, and had its own army, and so it was like, I teach at Columbia, which is of course the sworn enemy of NYU, and so the book was, kind of an academic satire. But as the pandemic progressed, it felt strange to write about it because I kept thinking, geez, like there's a real tragedy happening. I mean, people were dying quite a bit at that time, and also a political tragedy because a certain leader, and I did everything the president said. I drank all of the bleach. I was the most wormed person out there, and sunlight, everything I did. But it felt like a kind of double tragedy that by far superseded the academic dystopian book that I was writing. So I decided to switch, just dump 240 pages of book. I don't know if you've ever done that. Dumped.
Yeah.
You have, okay.
It's the worst thing I've ever done.
It's the worst thing, and I've done it twice. I've dumped about 480 pages of books. I know, what can I tell you? I just want to outsource my next books to India or somewhere where they write better and for less. But, I was, and then the only thing that saved me from not having anything was this rereading Chekhov all the time, thinking, why don't I write a small, but hopefully not too small, comedy set in upstate during this very pandemic?
Well, so Uncle Vanya comes up a lot in your book, and there's characters reading Uncle Vanya. They actually stage Uncle Vanya at the end, and some real parallels with Uncle Vanya. You know, there's a younger woman who becomes the object of competition between two men. You know, there's some real parallels. And I'm curious, how did you use that play when you wrote your book? Was it a model? Was it something you were riffing on? Was it kind of a talisman? How were you thinking about Uncle Vanya?
It's interesting. Now that you mention it, I did completely rip off Uncle Vanya. But when I wasn't doing that, I was busy ripping off some of the short stories. And as much as I love all of the plays, and obviously Uncle Vanya and The Cherry Orchard stand is great. The Cherry Orchard with all its intimations of real estate, real estate come and gone, which is what this book is about as well. It's the short stories, and there's 3 cycles of them. I want to remember what they are in English. It's The Man in the Shell, About Love, and Gooseberries. And what I loved about those short stories is that it really is men, and this obviously in the book it's not just men, it's half and half, but people sitting around in a Banya-like setting and feeling that for the first time they're able to unbosom themselves and talk about what went wrong. Because I think in Russia, in dealing with Russia, and I know, and you've done this in your wonderful memoir, Young Heroes of the Soviet Union, which I recommend insanely, just incredible, that there's almost no talk about the present or the future because all that remains is the horrors of the past. So that an entire lifetime is spent just dissecting what went wrong in the past. And that lends itself wonderfully to literature, which is why Russia produces almost nothing of value other than literature and some of the ancillary arts. What was the last Russian product you enjoyed? The Matryoshka phone, the M phone. So, to me, that became kind of the motif of the book. Now, the book has, there's 2 characters of Russian origin, but all the other people are, because they're all from that Stuyvesant-like school, they're from Korea, they're from India. And in my own life, that's pretty much, most of the people I know are people from similar circumstances. My wife, for example, is Korean American. So, and all of them have this kind of Soviet Jewish feeling that the past is never the past, that the Korean Civil War or partition in India or Mao's Cultural Revolution, all these things that destroyed their families, just eviscerated their families, are just, 2 meters behind them. They're always crouching. And the way their grandparents mumble in the night, and you have this in your memoir as well, this constant mumbling in the night, My mother still mumbles in the night because she's worried. I think one of her relatives was buried alive under Hitler or something, and so she's afraid that she's in a coffin. All of this stuff gets transmitted incredibly on and on. I have a 9-year-old kid who was born in Manhattan, has what seems to me like a magical life. He has clothes and 2 roofs over his head. But all that Soviet Jewish angst, I can just smell it in him. It's like he can't, and the best shrinks in town, obviously. We have all of NYU studying him, but it's not enough. You need Hofstra too,
Epigenetics.
And what?
Epigenetics.
Epigenetics, thank you, epigenetics. And which you also mentioned in your book, so. Yep.
But one thing that did occur to me, there's definitely tragedy in your book. But unlike Uncle Vanya, which ends, I would say, on a rather, despairing note, your book actually ends on a very warm note. This note of this group of characters who are essentially making an elective family in this bungalow colony that Senderovsky, your protagonist, builds to kind of recreate the Russian Jewish bungalow colonies of his youth. And it's really hopeful. There is a sense that these are folks who, have earned enough money to have the comforts of a bourgeois life, and they're enjoying it. And there's something really, and the characters, people often refer to you as a satirist, but I actually don't think this is a satirical book. They're just satirical descriptions. The world is satirical, but the characters are really warm. They have very elaborated pasts. They're complex. They're likable, and I think. So I was wondering, is this kind of the terminus of the immigrant experience? Like, I remember in Guyana they used to have this thing called acculturation. We were all being acculturated, which I think meant like becoming more American. So is this sort of what all the acculturation was for? Does Senderovsky finally find a home at the end?
You know, since turning 50, I've been feeling a lot better, a lot more American, and I think in part it's because I learned how to drive. Very, like Sasha in the book, very badly. I'm a terrible driver. But the new cars don't allow you to kill other people because they kind of stop for you. So I've been feeling really good about that. And knowing how to drive now, I can drive across the river upstate, and I go to this Kingston Mall, and I buy these gigantic Charmin. Are you familiar with it? Yeah. And I buy like family size, like 100 rolls, and I stuff it into my large car. And I'm like, so this is what it was all about, right? Like, this is the terminus. Now, I am American now. I have a license, I have Charmin, I know how to handle the gas pump. But my happiest memories growing up, which is why in the book Sasha Senderovsky has this Russian bungalow colony, my happiest memories by far was a Russian bungalow colony named the Ann Mason Bungalow Colony in Ellenville, New York. And I don't think you went to one, right? You didn't?
No,
you didn't. Yeah.
I did not.
To me, this was, because I went to Salomon Schechter, and Salomon Schechter, everyone just bullied me as they bullied you because I was the stinky Russian bear, because I had this like hat made out of a woodland elk or something, and a shruba coat to match it. And I remember it was so bad that I would tell kids that I wasn't born in Leningrad, I was born in East Berlin. And you know, when you try to convince Jewish kids that you're actually a German, things are not going well. But the bungalow colony was our respite from all that, because everyone spoke Russian, everyone had a babushka who ran after them with plates of farmer's cheese and kasha and fruits, and it felt, today kids would refer to it as a safe space, and that's exactly what it was. You know, I was getting my ass kicked 9 months out of the year, and then safe space, new. So that's why and although I can't afford the 5 bungalows that Sasha has in the book, I have one bungalow where I have friends from the city stay, a kind of urban fresh air fund. You're welcome to come. And so to me, that was very important to do just for myself, but also to write about. Because again, this feels to me like a safe space, especially given what was happening in New York at the time. And later, for example, there was a lot of anti-Asian violence that after our president of the time started talking about the Wuhan flu, et cetera, and my wife, who's Korean American, was very worried about that. So our house up there became a kind of refuge, if you will. Did you have I'm sorry, there was another question behind that, and I may have forgotten it.
No, I was just wondering if, we're supposed to, according to the press materials, we're supposed to talk about our Soviet immigrant journey, and I was wondering if that was sort of, the happy ending to Senderovsky's
I would say 2 things.
Soviet immigrant journey.
There's a hilarious scene which may be taken from real life in Jeffrey Eugenides' Middlesex, which I'm sure some of you have read, where they're workers at a Ford or a GM plant in, I think, the 50s or the 60s, and they have this ceremony where they all show up and they're wearing like their dress from Greece or Yugoslavia, whatever, Croatia. They're wearing their national dress, and then they all hop into this giant cauldron that someone is stirring. And then the door opens at the bottom of the cauldron, and they all walk out wearing Ford uniforms. So that was the idea of acculturation. We throw you all into this cauldron. It's going to be a little toasty there for a while. People are going to make fun of you, but in the end, you're going to walk out and you're going to be a great labor force. So l'chaim, good luck. And then and Diana kind of didn't do that, but I remember these hilarious. You may have written some. I don't know if you wrote them. There were these brochures that were just like what to say at a party when Americans are at a party. Like, first of all, don't drink 12 drinks in 30 minutes, right? Because Americans don't do that, And then don't start making out with the wife of whoever invited you, right? You're not in Russia anymore. Huge chapters on deodorant use. Like, I remember, with coupons for Tom of Maine's deodorant. I still remember that. What was it? Welfare. Don't rip off welfare. I remember this was illustrated by the picture of a welfare queen, as she was called, walking out of a welfare office wearing her mink coat on her way to her Mercedes car. Anyway, so this is the stuff I was writing. And it was so strange because I'm thinking, I do have kind of relatives like that. This is not,
The advice I remember hearing from an acculturation counselor was that when Americans ask you, how are you, they don't expect an answer. Don't tell them.
Because the Russian answer is not good, not good.
Yeah, the Russians are like, my gum is bleeding.
My gum,
Yeah.
my pudendum is, oi. Yeah. Let me talk, I can draw you a little diagram.
Yeah, there was a lot of acculturation.
Yeah. No, I remember, like, my relatives would come to some American's house. They'd be like, "Wow, how much do you make?"
This reminds me of hearing that I was really into hip hop in the '80s as like an adolescent, and I recently learned that a lot of the rappers from that era had all gotten bungalows in Long Island in the same little cul-de-sac, and it just sort of. What's more American than that, right? Yeah. It's like you finally made it.
Finally made it. No, I agree with that.
So I want to ask you this because I'm a nonfiction writer, and that's all I do.
Yeah.
I write magazine stories and books. You, however, write fiction, nonfiction, television writing. I want to ask you about this, the theater piece that you had mentioned to me. But your fiction has so much autobiography in it. And then you write about yourself also in a nonfiction form. So I'm really curious, I've never had ever the desire to invent that fiction writers have, to make up characters. Of course, when you write, you realize it's a lot of the same work. Yeah. But for you, what is the difference for you between writing in the fiction mode and the nonfiction mode?
Well, fiction comes a lot easier because you can just lie, obviously, and that's great. And the research, you have to do some research, but not as much. And some of the stuff I write is dystopian, like a Super Sad True Love Story was dystopian, so you just create your own society and do whatever the hell you want there. Nonfiction is very rigorous. A lot of the nonfiction I write is for The New Yorker, and it's just brutal because you spend 2 weeks writing a piece, and then you spend literally 4 weeks fact-checking it. And the fact-checking is, I'm tearing what little hair left I have out because it's just
horrifying. Yeah.
It's The
New Yorker especially. Yeah.
The New Yorker is known especially. The Times is a little easier, but the New Yorker is brutal, and that's who I think I've written some of my best pieces for. But and I hope I don't bore the audiences with oh, now he's going to do this in nonfiction mode, yay! And after I wrote Little Failure, which was my memoir, I thought I wouldn't write nothing more about the Soviet Jewish experience. And my next novel, Lake Success, was about a still Jewish, but non-Russian Jew, just a normal garden variety Jew from Great Neck, a hedge fund manager and his journey across America. The novel after that was this, Our Country Friends, which has 2 Russians, but doesn't talk about the immigrant experience too much, but it's about a group of mostly immigrants from all over the world. And then I was thinking of something else for the new book, but then the war in Ukraine broke out. And I began to realize how some of the people around me were dealing with information, disinformation, and it seemed like yet another reckoning for the Soviet Jewish community. And I was like, what's that line from Godfather? Just when I thought I was out, they dragged me back in. So the new book I'm writing now is also starting to handle stuff like misinformation and the war in Ukraine and stuff like that.
And it's a fiction book.
And it's fiction, yeah. So it's hard. It's hard to say. I mean, I think the material of Soviet that those of us from the former Soviet Union have is so crazy. You read. I was reading your book, and it's like every page there's something that would never happen anywhere in North America. It's just all outlandish. That's the way people treat each other. The way families treat each other is on such a more. The fights are so operatic. Like my parents couldn't just have a kind of fight that I sometimes hear, Americans have, or when I fight with my wife, it's like that. It's like, and things, breaking plates, etc. It's like The Sopranos, but with much worse food.
But more Jewish.
More Jewish.
So, speaking of which, I wanted to talk about our motherland. You were born in Leningrad in 1972. I was born in Moscow in 1970. We came here as children, and I think which allowed so much acculturation to happen for us. And I'm sure, I don't think I'm assuming much by saying that, like me, you've probably been watching the events unfolding in Russia right now with unremitting horror. You just this week, the New York Times posted a video in which you talk about Father Jan Burden, who is a Russian Orthodox priest who was essentially, fired from his position at his church and dragged into a police station for questioning because he had the temerity to, in his sermon, to criticize the special military operation, and as it's called. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are about watching this kind of happening in the world right now. As somebody who wrote a book about Soviet history, it's a family memoir that spans Soviet history, it's very bizarre and unsettling to watch it start to repeat itself. Russia right now under Putin reminds me a lot of the Soviet Union in the early 30s. And my hope is that it doesn't become the Soviet Union in the late 30s, because that would be much worse.
Much worse.
So what does it feel like for you to watch this?
I spent 7 days writing a New York Times Magazine piece where they put me up at the Four Seasons Hotel, and they put up 7 monitors, and each one showed a different Russian channel. This was 2014. And so just propaganda 24/7. And it was amazing. Like, by the time I walked out of that room, I barely knew what the hell was going on, because lies repeated, and there are certain American networks that also have mastered this very well. And it's incredible. Your idea, your sense of stability goes. It's not that you disbelieve it so much as the Russian way of thinking is, we don't know what the truth is. I was talking to some relatives of mine about the election, and they don't believe. I said, well, do you think Biden didn't win? And they said, well, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. It seems like we'll never know. And that is the Kremlin. That is exactly always been its strategy about destabilizing what the truth is and creating avenues of, we will never know. Everybody does this. Okay, we do this, but America does this too. A kind of both-siderism that even within our country a certain political party practices. So all of this to me is incredible. What was also incredible in watching some of my relatives was the fact that they fled the Soviet Union because they knew that the Soviet propaganda was wrong, was lies, everything was lies. And they fled to America, and they got here, and now they're listening to the same Kremlin propaganda, often by the children of the people who made the original propaganda in the Soviet Union. Now, instead of far left, it's far right, but it's still there, and they're still believing it. And with terrible repercussions, not getting vaccinated, stuff like that. And to me, that is, I mean, it's like history repeating again, And so it's zakaldovny krug. It's a cursed circle that one just can't escape from.
Yeah.
But makes for good fiction,
Yeah, it does seem to be that way right now. I wanted to maybe shift gears a little bit to a lighter subject. Well, lighter not for you perhaps, but a couple of years ago, and forgive me if I'm misdating it, but you wrote a really vivid piece for The New Yorker about a problem with a part of your anatomy that is not often mentioned at literary festivals.
Just Google Shteyngart bad circumcision, and you'll be happy.
And when we were talking before this event, you mentioned that you were thinking of doing a one-man show on this very subject, and I'm sure, like a lot of people here, I'm intensely curious. So, can you please tell us what you have in mind?
Thank you for caring about my schlong, first of all. It's very nice to be in a Jewish institution that's concerned about, Yeah, so actually it happened in 2020 as I was writing Our Country Friends. I was circumcised, like many ex-Soviet Jews were, when I came to this country in 1979 at the wonderful Coney Island Hospital, rated one of the worst hospitals in the universe, not even beyond Earth. It's like, yeah. Yeah, so they did a terrible job. One of the worst circumcisions ever performed. And someone's leaving, good, yes. That's always happens. Someone's like, I tried to listen to the schlong story, but I'm dying. I'm dying inside. But so without getting too graphic, and I really would need like a a PowerPoint. Things fell apart in the middle of the pandemic, 2020, and I could barely move. I couldn't walk. I couldn't. The schlong couldn't touch any surface. I went to about 20 wonderful doctors throughout New York. And I was prescribed every medication imaginable to, basically the idea was to sever signals sent from the groinal region to the spine. And some of these drugs made me hallucinate. Now, without giving away too much of Our Country Friends, the very last part of the book, someone is hallucinating as something terrible happens to him medically, not this. And that was art imitating life, because I would take these pills, I would wake up, for hours I wouldn't know what was happening, and I would go on these crazy astral journeys. And then 3 hours in, the journeys would stop, and I would write down what happened. And then I would take the pill again, and the next morning it would all repeat. So the last chapters, if they're confusing to you, they're all very much a product of a combination of very top-of-the-line drugs that all kind of integrated together to form this completely secondary universe. It's interesting, because a lot of writers want to enter this kind of secondary universe. I was just entering it in the guise of, schlong relief.
Perhaps under different circumstances.
Perhaps under different circumstances, yes. And in terms of, and then I wrote a piece for the New Yorker, which I do encourage people to read. It's gotten quite a reception from the Jewish community. I've heard a lot. Some Moyles want to kill me. They want to complete the circumcision, but take the rest.
There's been a lot of Moyle reaction.
A lot of Moyle rage, especially in the more Haredi, Hasidic part of the Moyle spectrum in the Holy Land. But also a lot of rabbis who have reached out and said, look, I agree that, because part of the research for this book was reaching out to other men whose circumcisions went horribly, horribly wrong. And I found gazillions of them. They are, I think the rate is like something like 1.9% of all circumcisions have complications. Some of these complications aren't so bad. Some of them are so terrible that these men have never married, have never had relationships. So there's quite a few of them. And I would get packets of mail from them saying, thank you, because nobody wants to talk about it because they see it as a terrible thing. They want to have relationships, but people are going to know they have problems with their schlongs. And the reason I could write about it, look, I'm in my 50s, I'm married and I have a kid. I don't care, I don't care what people think of my down under region. So there was, and right now, I've never done this, but I want to do a one-person play. And already I have the theater for it, I have the script, so we're starting to develop it. Hopefully by next year, I invite you all to come. It'll just be me, a one-man play, but there will also be someone dressed as a penis. And I want different actors to play the penis every week. I'm good friends with Isabella Rossellini. I think she would be the great first penis. And then, as my director said, just find more dickish actors out there. And I was like, I have the whole Rolodex of dickish actors. But it's also good, and you're talking about different ways of doing it. When I wrote that one-man play and thought about what it would look like to present it, a whole different part of me began to be activated, a very different part. I teach creative writing at Columbia, and what I always tell these students is you got to find your voice. If you're writing the way you think a writer writes, you're not doing it right. And often that's what I find. I don't find an original voice. I find somebody going through the motions of what a hip young writer should sound like. And I find that in writing a monologue, it's so much easier to do that. It's so much easier to be completely raw and naked on the stage, especially as you're writing about schlongs. But I almost wish that I had. Back when we were at the Oberlin Institute for Lonely Individuals, that I had taken theater, instead of doing pre-law, which of course my parents wanted me to do. A lot of good that did, but I wish I'd taken theater there,
Thank you. Is it time for some audience questions?
All right. Oh, the New Yorker article is named My Gentile Region. Right. Well, and it has a funny. The name is funny in part because I show up at I'm up by Rhinebeck, and I show up at the Rhinebeck urgent care, and there's kind of triage at the time because there's all these it's COVID time, right? So there's a huge line, and I'm like hobbling over there, and the woman, this lovely country woman, is like, "Honey, what's wrong with you?" And I'm like, "There's this," and I try to explain, and she wanted to say, "Oh, baby, it must hurt so bad to have something wrong in your genital region." But she said, "Oh, honey, there's something wrong. It must be so hard to have something wrong in your gentile region." And I was like, because that's the whole joke, right? Because if it had stayed gentile, no. So this is the thing, right? This is why sometimes nonfiction and journalism rocks, because especially, I mean, recently, you were mentioning earlier that I'm sort of moving away from more satiric works, partly because, especially after the last 6 years, when our special president entered the chat, it was hard to do satire. How do you go beyond that? I mean, we're drinking bleach.
Trump would never work as a fiction character because people would say that's just too broad.
Trump wouldn't work. None of this would work. Elon Musk wouldn't work. None of this. It's all bananas. And the other part I would say also about, doing more nonfiction, memoir, etc., is as you're older, you become, and especially for me, as I've had a kid, I think some of the sort of, angry young youth, because, works like Absurdistan, my earlier books that were just me fulminating about whatever, the State Department, I don't know, I had a new target every year. All of that becomes to sort of pale by next to the feeling of wanting to just have a small little plot of something to yourself, of small family, even a small little dacha, all of this stuff. Your worldview is still large, but a part of you seeks the familiarity of things that are very close to you. And I think that makes for a less satirical book. I hope that I'm still funny, because I would hate to write something not funny. That would be sad. But even my schlong piece, my Gentile region, a lot of the responses were, you made me laugh a lot, even as you're literally considering suicide, because your schlong will never heal.
Any questions?
Over here. Yes. I would like to go back to the beginning of your talk, and you mentioned how you read Chekhov. And so my question is, did you read Chekhov in Russian? And did you read it in English? Do you compare and make sure that you have a good understanding?
Yeah. So that's a very good question. So I would read Chekhov nonstop. When I came to America, when I was 8 or 9, I read a lot of his stuff because the short stories especially are much more understandable to a child. And we had this gigantic wall of books, probably you did as well. All the Russians came they dragged all their books from the Soviet Union. So we had all these books, and then, the Sidur, right, in this pride of place, blocking Pushkin. But everything else was like the collected works of Chekhov, the collected works of Turgenev, et cetera, et cetera. So Chekhov I would read a lot because in my family, and I don't know if it's the same as yours, my parents wanted me to retain a high level of Russian, and so in the home we only spoke Russian. There was no English in the house. That was one very nice thing my parents did, because it meant their English never developed as well, because having a child who speaks the language, the child is almost, introduces you to the language, and the correct idioms and stuff like that. So I was able to retain Russian to be able to travel back to Russia. Now I'm not allowed in. I was actually stopped at the airport in 2014. It could have been like the woman that was just Brittany Griner, right? But I also do like to read him in English because I love to hear how different translations sound. There's a new one that's pretty good. I think that's the Balkonskys that have been redoing everything, the Balkonskys. So that's good too. So I would read a little bit of both, however the whim struck me. And I remember in Solomon Schechter, I think it was like, I don't know, 4th grade, and it was the parent-teacher meeting, and my father goes in, and this teacher's like, wow, we hear Gary is so smart. He reads Tolstoy in the original Russian. And my father says, bah, only Chekhov. So yes, even today, only Chekhov. But thank you for the question.
I liked your Russian prince rendition very much in the video on the New York Times.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for that. Last night I was, maybe some other people saw this too. There was a thing on CNN about Alexei Navalny, and he was talking about his poisoning. But I'm sitting there thinking, what is this thing that Russians have with poisoning? You know,
Windows, we don't like windows, very dangerous.
even Alexei said, you want to kill someone, just shoot him.
Gary, why do we like to poison people so much?
I like to poison people with my cooking, perhaps. Yeah.
Is there some kind of
There's a long tradition.
don't understand?
Yeah, Russians were always into interesting assassinations, murders. Not only Russians, a lot of the other countries. Bulgaria perfected the umbrella that shoots poison darts. You know,
Which was made in the KGB laboratories.
made in a KGB lab. Okay, so it does go back to us. Yeah. I was like, it hurt to give them the pride of place for creating the poisoned umbrella. But yeah, no, weird ways of killing each other has always been a look. Yeah, literature and poisoning people. those are our things. Maybe the Bolshoi and the Marinsky. But yeah,
Caviar.
Look, and what?
Caviar.
Caviar is very nice. You know, my mother wouldn't let me go back to Russia when I was in college. Did you go back in college? No.
I did.
You did.
I did.
Your dad
actually.
was still there.
But my dad lives in Moscow, so yeah.
I was supposed to go to Moscow State University as an exchange student, and she said, they will eat you alive. Oh, and she kept talking about windows. She's like, they're going to throw you, because it's a gigantic building, and the dormitories are very high, and your mom went to that. And she said, the students, she really never believed in my popularity. She was like, the other students will throw you out of the window. That was her. Yeah, what? I'm sorry? Defenestration, yeah. The generals have been falling out of windows. Yeah, so instead I went to Prague's Charles University, which has very small buildings, no high rises. Prague also has a tradition of defenestration back in the day. So yeah, I would be more scared of windows than other things. Yeah, look out for windows, folks.
Why were you so persecuted at the Solomon Schechter School? For the other students,
I'll repeat it.
the other students probably had 2 generations previous Eastern European origins, and surely you weren't the only Russian emigre child in this school. So
Well, there
why
were
were you so victimized?
Well, there were 3 Soviet children at the school, and all 3 of us were incredibly victimized. Yeah, everybody did good. One of them was Irina Rain. She's a great novelist. So our victimization really led us to some wonderful career paths. But I think it was, and you also experienced this victimization, but in public school. This was 1979, 1980. I remember every single thing that happened on the geopolitical stage was brought down on the level of interpersonal 8-year-old relations. So when KL, the Korean airliner, was bombed by the Soviets, a couple extra beatings would come out of there. You know, it was because the kid, you know, they would say, you're a communist, and I'd say, but I'm not. We came here to get away from all that. But nobody really understood that. The sort of thing that my parents didn't understand is they thought that if they sent me to a Hebrew school, everything's going to be great because Jews love other Jews. But we were so different from other Jews. There was like nothing in common. They were, you know, middle class, upper middle class. They all had very nice sedans. We were like, all of the clothes I got were hand-me-downs from collections that the secretaries at the school had. So I'd be walking around and somebody'd be like, hey, that's my Batman t-shirt, you know? And I'm like, here comes the beating, here we go. You know, so it was interesting, you know, it kind of, the idea, but what I think the reason some of us were very obstinate after that kind of experience, and because like my parents were always said, you know, you got to be a lawyer or whatever, is that we realized from an early age that nobody was going to look out after us. If our fellow Jews, you know, were calling us the stinky Russian bear, which was basically my nickname of choice, then what hope was there for anyone, you know? And so you had to do things alone. You had to go at it alone. And to this very day, you know. I mean, I never even thought I'd get married because it's so hard for me to envision sharing, you know, decisions with somebody because all I know is my own mind, you know. Yeah, well, that's interesting. I mean, I wonder about that. I mean, it would be interesting to see. A lot of these kids also were Israeli, right? So they did not have those roots. And there was a kind of, I think, friction between them. There were some Persian Jews. I mean, it was Queens, right? So it's a lot of different things. But yeah, I'm sure there were some with German roots who probably skipped the Lower East Side altogether. And, but I'm sure many who also probably grew up in the same Ukrainian mistiechki, the little places that our parents did. Yeah.
Well, I can confirm that I went to a yeshiva for middle school up in the Upper East Side, and I remember being sent home every Shabbat because we were supposed to dress up, and I had a uniform of like bell-bottom polyester slacks and like a ballooning polyblend business shirt, you know, that we got at the discount store. And I remember just the headmaster would come and send me home in front of all the other students in the school, which was incredible.
I remember the Soviets, we were always like asked to step aside and humiliated in some weird way because we didn't know some right or something, you know. But I struck back in, I guess, 4th, 5th grade, and because we all kind of hated these rabbis who were always screaming at us with a bullhorn, you know. So I started writing my own version of the Torah that I called the Genora, because my nickname was Gary Gnu. And it was written on a scroll, an actual scroll. And so, you know, chapters like Exodus became Sexodus. And instead of Sarah and Abraham, it was like John McEnroe and Brooke Shieldowitz. Her name was Brooke Shieldowitz. And that made me my first American friends, you know, and kind of stopped the teasing and the beatings because it was like, he's not a communist, he's just this weird kid, you know, which was a lot better than being the stinky Russian bear. So in a way, words were my exit strategy out of that hell, you know, and into Oberlin.
Do you know, I remember your first book, Little Failure, and when you mentioned you went to Stuyvesant, I remember the piece where your mother came to hid behind trees to take you home because it was much more safer being with her than your friends. But then I read Sad True Love Story, and your prediction about the future was so obvious, where people would be walking past a pole that would give them the genetic information about the people, their bloodline, how much money they had in the bank, and it's becoming so true today of all of that technological information. What made you think of it so in the 70s as a young man?
Well, let me tell you this. Some of this technology that you're talking about, in the book I called them credit polls because they texted you credit, but that's happening. The leader in all that is China, the People's Republic, which has all this stuff. You basically carry around a credit score which is influenced by how patriotic you are. And how so like, let's say Alex is a dissident and he and I trade a couple of texts or whatever, my social score goes down. And when my social score goes down, I can't get a mortgage, I can't, my kid can't go to a good university. It's like everything that the Soviet Union had, but in algorithmic form, which is like, kudos to them. They're always a step ahead. Good job. But yes, when I was growing up, my mother would hide behind trees and poles to make sure that I would get, this is at Stuyvesant, that I would get from Stuyvesant to the L train, which is literally a block away. But us Stuyvesant kids were such nebbishes, to use the Yiddish term of art, that there was a special safe train. I don't know if you had this. This was my year, where the L train was filled with like commandos with guns, and they're like, "Come on, nerds, come on, get on that train," Make sure we wouldn't get mugged on the 2-block walk to the L train. So, so you ask where my dystopian stuff comes from. I think growing up in the Soviet Union and then Ronald Reagan's America, it's just like that. It's so easy to come up with a future that's both. What I also love about the Soviet Union is that it's dystopian, but it's also like, as we see in this war in Ukraine, it's completely incompetent too. It's like an incompetent dystopia, which I guess is better than a competent dystopia like Nazi Germany, right? Because they can't even win this war. They have an army that's like 10 times the size, they have a population 10 times the size, an economy 10 times the size. They can't do, they're always being beaten, And that creates for a kind of Kafkaesque dystopian flavor that I think is very helpful for writers like us. Any last questions or concerns?
People that you speak to in Moscow. What
Is
are
that
they?
question for me?
Yeah.
I have not spoken to them a lot because a lot of the methods by which we speak, Facebook Messenger, Instagram Messenger, have been banned in Russia. They've been taken offline. But I've definitely spoken to friends and to colleagues, and I think they are horrified. They are, I think when I spoke last to my sister, she said that she didn't know anyone who supported the war, but they were petrified to go outside because even standing in the street with a sign now in Moscow is a 15-year prison sentence. It's a beating, and it's also probably going to spread to your family. Your kids could lose their place at a university, or you could lose your, So it's very draconian. So, if you're going to, and clearly we just saw, a dissident politician basically stay and go to prison willingly, which is incredibly courageous. But for most people, it is I think a bridge too far. It's just the punishment is so severe that I think most people are just afraid. And of course, there are undoubtedly people, especially outside of the big cities, who do watch Channel 1 and do believe the propaganda, and some support the war. But I think right now the dissent is so thick and deep that it is I think very difficult to hear those voices, which are there.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. Oh, there's one more question. Sorry.
This is for both of you. Could you mention any contemporary Russian language poets that you think are really great that also might be available in English?
That was for you.
Contemporary Russian poets.
Yes.
Wow, that's an interesting question.
Who's the guy that's from Odessa? You know what I'm talking about?
I don't think so.
He wrote a book called Odessa. Oh, shit. You answer it.
I'm in Russia today. My mother translates poetry, and she's right there. Sorry, that was unprofessional of me to turn it over to my mother in the audience.
Boris Khersonsky.
Vladimir Gandelsman.
Yeah, Gandelsman. Yeah. I would add, since we're on a Ukrainian tip, which is great because right now I'm reading a lot of Ukrainian stuff, and I wish I knew the language. Poet Ilya Kaminsky, and he wrote Odessa. He's from the city of Odessa. Yeah, and I would also, I know this is prose and not fiction, but recently, and he's a friend of mine. I visited him in Kiev before all this nonsense happened. Andrei Kurkov, Kurkov, and he's written beautiful. He has this famous Penguin, Death and the Penguin is one of his books, but he wrote a great book called Gray Bees, Graybees. Which is about not this current stage of the war, but between this war and the invasion of Crimea.
Yeah, to that I would also add Serhiy Zhadan, Zhadan. He's probably the greatest poet in Ukraine, and he's in Ukraine right now, and his writing is absolutely beautiful. And it's widely translated into English, and really well, in my opinion.
This is great. I'm glad we ended on that question because
Thank you for
right
that
now
question.
is a great time to, and the other thing is, as those of us, I mean, I have obviously heritage from Ukraine. You probably have also, yeah. I mean, it's, right. So in reading a lot of Russian literature and poetry, you encounter so much anti-Ukrainian sentiment, including probably the poet that most of us loved the most, who came from this generation, which is Joseph Brodsky. And some of the stuff he's written about Ukraine after the independence is shocking, you know. And in the end, I'm not into the idea of getting rid of someone's work just because I disagree with them on one or two works, but it is shocking the extent to which this anti-Ukrainianism was built into and colonial attitude toward other peoples, including
I mean, the word Ukraina really comes from Ukraina, which means the boonies, which means like a province. So it tells you something about the Russian attitude towards its neighbors.
Well, but anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.